Right then, dear friends, we have today Dee Ryding. I hope I pronounced that right.
It's Ryding, but it's fine.
Ryding. Dee Ryding, who will be speaking to us on something which, when I saw the title, I thought, that's interesting. I wonder what that's about. And the title which was given was Divine Ceremony. I am sure that we will be much more informed when Dee starts. So, when you're ready, Dee.
Okay.
Please begin.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you so much for asking me to come along and talk to you all today. My name is Dee Ryding, and I am founder and owner of Divine Ceremony. I'm an undertaker and a funeral director, and I was a celebrant for over 10 years previously. And I am really glad to be able to talk to you all today. I wish the meeting was in person, but here we are. It's another Zoom moment for us all. So I hope that the technology stays with us for the duration. I was really touched to be asked by Patsy to talk with you all today, and I appreciate that death, dying and funerals aren't perhaps everyone's favourite topics of conversation. But for me, they have become something of a vocation over the last 15 or so years. Although it must be said that in my previous working life within the worlds of media and theatre production, that I would never have imagined that I would be one day giving talks on this particular subject. So I have entitled my talk today, How Important is the Ceremony to the Funeral? And I'm hoping that that will give us all a fairly good idea of where I'm going with this. I'll talk for around 20 minutes. Is that okay with you all? And then there'll be time at the end for any questions that you may have. And don't be shy. I hope that you'll also understand that for me, this subject is something of a passion. And actually, I just want everyone to understand and know what I know, because having an understanding of the choices that are available to us all can be really helpful to all of us at some point in our future lives. So I thought it might be helpful to give you a little background of my journey to sitting here as an undertaker. So my journey to working as a celebrant and undertaker began some 15 years ago. I was working at the BBC as a series producer within the documentary unit. And it was a career that I'd fostered and nurtured really for the previous 15 years. And I absolutely loved my job. I met some wonderful people, travelled the world, and within the documentary unit, my job was really about storytelling. I spent years working within the observational unit, and here I'd really honed my skills as an interviewer and script writer. So I wrote 30-minute programmes, hour-long programmes, shaping the stories, teasing out the truth from the fiction, and finding the arc of the story that was new or fresh or a different take on what might perhaps be a well-known subject. I had no intention at that point of changing jobs or my career. And I just want to welcome Susan in. Hello, Susan. Hi.
Sorry, I'm late.
Oh, don't worry. I haven't said very much. I'm Dee Ryding, and I'm the undertaker funeral director for Divine Ceremony. So I was enjoying my career path, but sometimes life deals us a difficult hand. And there were a number of fairly significant events in my life in my early 30s that unwittingly set me off on a completely new path. The first was my granddad's death, which happened on the day of my grandmother's funeral. And so my family found ourselves dealing with two funerals within 2 weeks of each other. And the funerals were very expensive, and they did, to be honest with you, very little to support our grief, and really even less to honour and celebrate the lives of two very important people in my family. And as we left the church after my granddad's funeral, and I got back into the limousine, I turned to my husband and I said, you know, I could do better than that. You know, someone could do better than that. And around 6 months later, I wrote my first ceremony. for both my grandma and granddad. And we scattered their ashes under their favourite tree in their garden. We talked about their lives, their achievements, and this really became the funeral that we had sadly not had at that time. It was also my first foray into ritual, secular ritual in this case, but also a ceremonial response to the death of some of people that we loved. At around the same time, our good friend and neighbour Fred died after a very short illness, and his wife, Lita, came to see us the day he died and said, my husband, Fred, asked my husband to take the funeral. So my husband, Lawrence, was really touched by the request, but absolutely terrified by the prospect. So I said, well, why don't I write the ceremony and you deliver it? And so we did that. For my husband, it was one of the most terrifying moments of his life. And he came away from the ceremony saying, I never want to do that again. But for me, I just found it a wonderful experience. And the funeral director said, you know, you can write, you should do this for a living. And by now I was pregnant with my second child, our son, Billy. And to be honest, retraining at that point wasn't on my mind. Sadly, Billy died quite late in my pregnancy. And it was absolutely, I have to say, devastating for us all, really. This was around 15 years ago now. My daughter, the lovely Grace, was 5 at the time, and she just simply couldn't understand why her mummy had come home from hospital without a baby. Where was he? And for the first time in my life, I was completely lost, I have to say. I realised I didn't have any idea how to explain this tragedy or to frame it or to make it better. And an African friend of ours came to see me. And she said, you know, in my country, we would say that sometimes the babies don't come to stay, they come to guide you. And they didn't feel like particularly comforting words at that exact moment, but they did kind of pull me out of a bit of a despair. And I did what I know, which was I wrote another ceremony for just my husband and my daughter. And we planted a tree in the garden. And this simple ceremony shifted absolutely everything, really. It gave my daughter permission to talk about what had happened to us. She told anyone who would listen about her baby brother, Billy, and his tree, how she had chosen him a little cat so he wouldn't be on his own. And once again, I was struck by the importance of ritual in the process of saying goodbye, in the process of healing, and of the very weird nature of grief. It isn't linear. It doesn't just go away at some point. It kind of stays with you, and over time, you learn to carry it with you, really. When I returned to work after Billy had died, I was really, frankly, quite a changed person. I carried on working for about 18 months, but when the BBC announced a new redundancy round, I put myself forward and asked the BBC if they would retrain me as a celebrant. I completed the training the following year, and I've really never looked back. And I suppose in some ways, the journalist in me never really left. And I sort of made it my business to understand this new business, the business of funerals. I was interested in what makes Bristol funerals tick. Who are the players? How would I fit in with this new world? Who are the gatekeepers of the information? And how far can I go within this new territory? And I spent the following 5 years learning the ropes. I took 1,500 funerals during that time. And in 2014, I was really blessed because I was named National Celebrant of the Year, which was wonderful to have a validation of my work. It was, you know, a fantastic start to my business, really. It was a wonderful confidence boost. And through the Good Funeral Guide, I started meeting more progressive funeral directors who were working in a very different way to almost any funeral director that I was meeting in Bristol. But whilst I loved the job and I loved working with the families, I started to feel a bit dispirited with the industry itself. I can only really talk about my experiences in Bristol, but I think it's pretty widespread across the country. Getting a coherent feel for the business was hard. Language around funerals seemed problematic to me. What even is a funeral director? What are they directing? What is a committal? How on earth has it become normal to try and fit someone's life into a 20-minute ceremony? And religious or secular, I started to think that really things could be better than this. I started reading around the subject and discovered a gentleman called Tony Walter, who had written a book called The Revival of Death. And at the time, Tony was head of CDAS, the Centre for Death and Alternative Studies in Bath, which is kind of an academic approach to death and dying. I started to attend lectures and conferences and generally made a bit of a nuisance of myself with the academics. At one conference, I spoke to Tony about my views and frustrations with the industry, and I told him that I was thinking of becoming an undertaker and described to him my fledgling business model. As I spoke to Tony, he said, "You know, I am writing a paper on exactly this right now, the thrust of which is that the funeral industry is currently structured around the hardware, the cars, the coffin, the flowers, the orders of service, the men in black. But the software, the ceremony itself, the most important element of the service really, is kind of almost a secondary issue." And that was it for me. It was everything I started thinking about, and I started to do a lot more training courses, this time in death midwifery, practical courses on care of the body. And by now I was finding myself part of a much wider movement all across the UK of undertakers and funeral directors who are all approaching funeral care from a much more progressive, family-led perspective. Again, for all faiths and none. And in 2015, I launched my business, Divine Ceremony. I spoke at Bristol Big Green Week, and a week later, I brought this beautiful willow coffin up the harbour side and we into the Industrial Museum where we held the launch ceremony. And I chose the harbour because my great-grandparents were all sea pilots from Bristol Harbour. And in a way, it was, for me, a way of honouring my family, but it was also a way of asking people, how do you want to arrive at your funeral? I wanted people to see this beautiful coffin being brought around the harbour. During the event, I also launched the Home Funeral Network, which is an online resource to help families and professionals who might want more information or guidance about keeping somebody at home after they've died, if that's appropriate for them. And since then, I've supported many families to do just that, to care for their loved ones at home, whilst they plan for the funeral alongside family and friends as they come to pay their respects. That's not for everybody, but I think it is an option that people should know is available. I also spent many hours at hospital mortuaries, working with the staff there to learn best practice in death care. And over the following 5 years, I worked mostly from home, leasing mortuary space from other funeral directors, with the plan always being that I would one day have my own premises. I wanted to be really clear that when I took on my premises that I knew what I was doing. I took some time out to work with a strategist to help me hone a business plan and the reasons, and to really clarify the reasons why that we work the way we do. And so here with Divine Ceremony, we place the ceremony really at the very heart of the business. The software is what drives our world. And so when we meet with our clients, we talk about the person, we discuss their views, how they lived, how they died, what their wishes were if they talked about this. And we often work alongside families even before a death has occurred to help people really tailor their needs. And all decisions about the funeral comes then from this place, not the logistics or the hardware, if you like, encouraging people to work with us, taking on as much as they want to be a part of this process. So for me, transparency is absolutely key. And the days of the Wizard of Oz style funeral director performing their magic behind a curtain, I hope, are numbered, really. Families do need and want to be able to make informed decisions and choices. I can see in the last 5 years that the industry is changing. It's changing quite fast, reflecting those individual services, reflecting the life of the person who's died. Direct cremations are now on the rise, Westerly Crematorium, for example, offers a direct cremation service for just £400, which is significantly less than the £1,000 that a single slot at the crematorium would cost you. Now, for me, all of these things are kind of game changers. It means that we can split the ceremony, if you like, from the cremation or the burial. And I think this will become much more normalised. Ceremonies can take place almost anywhere that feels appropriate to the deceased and their families. Even awake when I'm awake is a thing now, thanks to Grace and Perry. And over the last few years, we have created ceremonies with the coffin in place at natural burial sites, church halls, people's gardens, allotments, even pubs. And each event has been specific to the person who has died and appropriate to them. So we know that we will all manage around 3 funerals in our lifetimes. And the sad thing is that most of us arrive at each of those events completely unprepared. And so having conversations early about what you would like to happen in the event of your death is so helpful to those that will be left behind making all these arrangements. The role of the funeral director or the vicar, priest, or the celebrant is actually quite key to all of this, I think. It's often through these people that we are able to find a space to ask those questions about a funeral. So I'm talking here about pre-need funeral planning, not just taking a funeral plan out, but actually what you would like to happen, where the ceremony should be held, what music would be played, what Bible readings or prayers should be shared, and perhaps in your case, how Quaker will your funeral be, if that's not too rude a question to ask. And I know that it's so much easier the process is so much easier for a family if these conversations have been had, and if importantly, those decisions or choices have been made known to those close to them. So we've created a My Wishes document to help our clients to fill out, to help guide people through this process. So if anybody would like a copy of that, we're happy to email them by. Currently, our COVID-aware world has presented its own challenges in more recent times. But I think we must continue to find appropriate ways to honour a life. We've got to strive to create appropriate ceremonies tailored to the individual and those left behind at the point of need, even despite restrictions we might be facing. Thinking of all these memorial ceremonies that we hope will be happening in the future is tiring. Grief doesn't wait until we have a more suitable number of people to attend. It just will be with us. And so for us, that meant embracing new technology, much as we're doing today, to help us come together even when we can't be together. So I feel that what we're doing is not rocket science, but it is important. And in a wider social context, I know that a good death, followed by an appropriate, considered funeral, leads to much less pressure on local services, much less complex, complicated grief for our families, less depression, less pressure on bereavement services, and much less antidepressant use if we are part of the process. So for us, being the very best undertakers that we can be is really, really important. I also believe that we should be mindful of reducing carbon emissions, really endeavouring to eschew more traditional diesel engines for perhaps electric vehicles. We need to be thinking carefully about flowers. Could we benefit from locally grown living wreaths over flowers flown in from miles away? What coffins do we use? Should we really be burning or burying MDF? And these are important choices, I think. They are akin to the recycling processes that we are used to now, but perhaps weren't used to in more recent times, until more recent times. I believe that many of what I would call the more modern funeral practices of large cars, huge floral displays will probably seem quite out of place in the not too distant future. And on my part, after a long search, I have found my home on the high street. I signed a long lease on a property in Bristol, which has become a real hub for ceremony for all faiths and none. And the sanctuary on Zetland Road is a beautiful old ex-bank, which I'm sure Mary will be able to attest to, with a lovely open space for ceremonies for up to 20 people and a small family consultation room, a viewing area and a working mortuary, including a space where families can be with us if they wish to be involved in the preparation of their loved one. We're also involved with the creation of the Bristol coffin, an entirely recycled coffin made in conjunction with Somerset Wood Recycling. And I continue to push my passion for getting the first urban natural burial deathscape up and running in Bristol. And we're really excited because we took delivery of Bristol's first electric hearse just a few weeks ago, something that we feel really proud of at Team Divine. So as we slowly move towards a more normal, open society once more, Divine Ceremony at the Sanctuary will be open for death cafes, for talks. We held Pilates classes here before the lockdown happened, yoga classes. Importantly, for us, it's a place for anyone who might be walking along the high street who suddenly finds that their grief is perhaps a little heavy and they need a space to come and take stock before they go home. So what began as a very personal response to a difficult number of experiences in my life has opened up a whole new world of opportunity. Working within the industry is so invigorating. It's so much about our lives. And I love my job. It's a fantastic job. And there's a lot that we can do to make this experience the very best it can be for all of us. In the last 15 years, I found myself fired up with positive potential, also ground down at times by the responsibility for this job. And in those moments, sometimes it's poetry that comes to my mind. And in paralysing moments of self-doubt, and there have been those, this is the one that has really sort of triggered for me. Life should not be an easy journey to the grave, with the intention of arriving safely in an attractive and well-preserved body, but rather to skid in sideways, chocolate in one hand, perhaps a glass of champagne in the other, body thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and screaming, woohoo, what a ride. And I'd really like to thank you all for listening today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. So thank you. I hope that was clear.
Well, I think that's a wow from me, because I have never heard of this, and it holds so much promise that, if you were, as that phrase goes, if you lose your details, I will get back to you, type of thing. But yes, it's something I would have liked for my parents and for my late sister as well, whose funerals have been procession lines. We do this now, we do that now, we look at the coffin, we go and have tea and sandwiches, and we all go home. We're not fulfilling in any reasonable way. So that's for me. So anybody who wishes to contribute or ask questions, the floor is open, friends.
David, I think you're muted.
I've just asked everybody else to unmute and didn't do it myself. That was really moving, Dee. Thank you so much. And I'm really, really touched by your talk. It's very much from the heart to the heart, I feel. And I can feel that you would bring that quality to ceremonies with people who really want to connect at this time. I've got some elderly relations who are approaching the end of their journey, and I'm thinking, I want to share this talk with people, just to, in case you're getting to that point, here's food for thought. I'm just interested that you're taking such what feels like a new approach, which we need in so many areas, not just funerals. Every area of life seems to me needs to be looked at in this thoughtful way that you are doing. And I'm wondering if you branching out to helping other organizations think how they connect authentically.
It's interesting because I've been talking quite a lot to GPs and district nurses, for example, and palliative care teams, because it seems to me that the process, currently we have a medical, our Medicare is over here, and then funeral care is somewhere over here. And then there is this very liminal space that we occupy that people suddenly find themselves in, and there are very few guiding points. And so part of, I struggle a little bit with the real fact, and it is a sadness really, that the expectation of the funeral director is pretty low. I experience that quite a lot. When people first speak to me, they're very often trying to keep me at arm's length. Their perception of funeral care is quite low. The expectation bar is really low. So encouraging people to really see us as support advocates for them, and not simply money-making machine that is there to do things that work for the funeral director, which really seems to be what people have experienced previously, is quite a challenge for us. I think really the conversation needs to be happening a lot earlier. So for example, if GPs and palliative care teams were able to talk to families before the event of a death, then these conversations could begin much earlier. As it is, it seems to me, particularly with a death at home, that suddenly once the person has died, all the medical teams leave the room and then the family are left alone. And that's where it becomes you're making decisions at quite an acute point of grief, which are hard to do. So yes, it's really lovely to hear that for you understand where the place that this is coming from. From my perspective, it's very hard to find platforms to have this conversation because we don't really want to talk about death. Whereas what I know, and this is for me the real passion, is that yes, death is the ultimate end result for us all, but it is always about our lives. We live in such an individual way that the process of saying goodbye to someone must surely be much better served if it is also in an individual way, and not a one-size-fits-all approach that works by and large for an industry and not for the families who are on the receiving end of the service. And that for me is quite key, is how do we kind of give people the confidence to hear these conversations, to have these conversations, knowing that, once you've done your wishes, you just put those alongside your will and you get on with leading your life, but you will know that your family will be much better served when the inevitable time comes.
Thank you.
Graham.
I think we can be fairly satisfied as Quakers that many of the reforms which Dee has talked about are pretty firmly in place. Any Quaker funeral will have a period of reflection and celebration of the life of the deceased friend, either at the funeral itself or in a memorial meeting afterwards, or both. We have a system of funeral advisors whose job it is to make sure that the right person conducts the funeral and does all the necessary investigation and consultation with the family beforehand. The issue for me recently has been increased need for environmental protection in relation to either cremation or natural burial. The move to have electric powered hearse as opposed to petrol or diesel engine is good, but that is relatively trivial, I think, compared with the environmental cost and the burning of gas caused by cremation. I attempted to work it out in relation to our home expenditure, and it came to about 3 weeks average gas consumption in the house would all be wasted on a single cremation. So I'm inclined now to go for natural burial on the grounds that this is more environmentally friendly. I wonder whether you detect that trend in the people who come to you for advice.
Thanks, Graham. I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, 5 years ago, the word green attached to or environmentally sound attached to a funeral had no impact at all. And I found that really dispiriting initially. It was almost as if there was a feeling that, look, the absolute worst has happened in our lives. We cannot be worrying about the planet now. And I could understand that to a certain extent. I think that the shift in the last 5 years has been, you know, really palpable, I mean, and which is great. So we certainly are seeing a lot more people coming in and talking to us about how they can approach the funeral in a much more sustainable way. So yes, ultimately, a natural coffin or a shroud and a natural burial would be a much better way to go, to be honest. Cremation can, you know, I think the problem is when you add up the diesel cars plus the MDF coffins plus the embalming fluids and a cremation and the flowers and the plastic and the oasis that go with the flowers, that's where you see the really big picture as to how harmful to our environment our funeral practices are. And I think we are going to see coming in, certainly within the next, I would say the next couple of years, a tax being applied to funeral directors and families who choose to go down those routes. And I think that would be appropriate. We do, I would say 80% of our families who work with us do want natural burial. You have the most wonderful site at Lower Hazel, and I've been very lucky to work with a number of families, Quaker families, where we've had burials at Lower Hazel. They used living wreaths, natural board coffins or shrouds, and the electric hearse. And I think it's not, as with most issues around the environment, it is never really one single element that will help us. It is a combination of factors. So I think the vehicles we're using, the boxes or the coffins, the shrouds, the flowers, all of these things together will help make a massive difference. But I do think there will come a point where the industry needs to look at itself and say, okay, some of these practices, the fact that we've been doing them for decades is perhaps not the way forward for our planet. And that's going to be a hard reckoning because the industry is geared to that hardware. You know, everything about the funeral industry is geared to big black gas guzzling cars, the coffins that look like traditional coffins, the flowers, grandma spelt out in flowers that has huge amounts of plastic involved, people arriving at crematoria with bouquets of flowers wrapped in plastic, flowers that have been dyed, flowers that have been flown over from Kenya that are then placed in a skip the next day. You know, we are not thinking about what happens when we die, very much in the same way that we didn't think about what we put in our black bins just 5 years ago. It would have seemed impossible for us to have shrunk our black bins to half the size and be recycling the way that we are, but we have managed to approach it in that way. And I think that it is only by steeling ourselves, Graham, to think about what it is that we are doing and how much lighter and touched on the planet we could give, that we will change things. So it is about having these conversations, but you're right, it's not about one single element.
Thank you.
Hello, Mary.
A few questions. You mentioned Grayson Perry. In what context was that?
So Grayson Perry, he made, I think you can probably still find the series on Channel 4. He made a series about ritual. And one of the programs, he focused on rituals around death and dying. And he worked with a family who the gentleman was terminal, he was at end of life, and they held a wake when he was awake. And Grayson made an enormous, fabulous pot that was a real depiction of this man's life. And during the funeral, or the wake, when the man was awake, he attended his own wake. Everyone came and they placed a little piece of paper into this pot as a mark of their memory of this man for the family to keep after he died. And it was a really, I mean, I found it an extraordinary program, because he went all around the world looking at different funeral practices and rituals around death and dying. And part of it was looking at how we approach death and dying, and how much more in touch we can be if we really take on board ritual. And I think this sort of touches a little bit on what Graham was saying earlier. You are really blessed within the Quaker tradition of having a framework, you know, and I think that is wonderful. You've got a very strong framework. You still need to make your individual choices and decide what emphasis you want to give in elements of that framework, but you do have a strong framework for what happens when somebody close to you dies. But not everyone has that. And so, you know, it's worth thinking around, for me, thinking around what ritual means, what ceremony means, even outside a religious context.
Thank you. And what was the quotation at the very end of your talk?
Oh, do you know, I knew you were going to ask that, Mary, and I can't remember the name of the person who wrote it, but I just, and I worried about reading it because I thought maybe it was a bit irreverent, but I also know that in amongst all of this, we are living, you know, like, how do we steel ourselves to talk about something which most people would find really challenging without also keeping a sense of humor?
Yeah. So what's the first sentence? And I'll Google it.
Oh yeah, Google it. So the first sentence.
Life should not
be an easy journey to the grave.
Okay, that'll do.
Yes, I should have checked that, shouldn't I? I think it might be Hunter S. Thompson, which would kind of make sense, wouldn't it? the American writer. I think it's him.
And I'm curious to know if Tim has come to terms with what you're doing, because you quoted his being upset at being a funeral director, didn't you? A funeral.
My husband. Oh, he's just, I think it was, I have to say, it was an immense shock to my entire family. I mean, my mother-in-law was horrified. Her comment was, Dee, you have been Dee from the BBC now for, well, it was nearly 20 years by the time I left. And I know what to say to my friends, but I don't know what to say to them now. And she was really horrified by, how will you cope being steeped in everyone else's morbid grief? But over the years, I tried to really reassure her that what I am doing is really, it is the most invigorating, fulfilling job I have ever had, because it is about life. You know, it's not always mired in desperate grief. I mean, obviously, I work with people who are grieving. I support people through that process. And we do, you know, Lorna and I, my colleague, we talk quite a lot about the fact that sometimes it's challenging to work within what is a very liminal space. How do you manage a life where you work in something that most people don't want to talk to you about? But yeah, my husband is very supportive. He just said, please don't wake me up at 4 in the morning and ask me to come with you when you need to go and collect someone. And I never have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I found the quote. It is from Hunter S. Thompson.
Is it?
I've put it in the chat with a link.
Yes, I've just taken a photograph of it. Thanks, David.
Sorry, Susan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm about to go flat. I was very disorganized this morning. So just to say if I disappear, it's not intentional. I was very interested that you say more and more people are having a separate ceremony of some sorts to the actual burial, or well, if people are being burnt, to the actual burning. And we did this happened with my father by default, in that where he had his funeral service was a church next door to where he lived, and when we tried to sort it was in the middle of massive roadworks timing. It was in and we actually couldn't get anybody to the church. Well, it was too complicated, so he went off on his own, or his body went off on his own, and actually that felt fine, because we had the service, we said goodbye to the car and to the body going off, and it worked absolutely fine. And I can see a lot to be said for that, particularly if you want to have, yes, and I do like the idea of having that sort of disposal of the body, which to me is just a disposal of a body, and the actual memorial meeting or the service. And there's some debate about, well, if you have a memorial service as well as a disposal, then you're saying that person's special. But I actually think there's a lot to be said for having a disposal and then having a memorial service when you can actually remember the person and appreciate their lives. The other issue for me is I'm thinking, oh no, I wish I could use you, but I can't, because 30 years ago or so, I was a lone parent with a daughter who was just embarking on, she was only about 19, 20, and I had to pay for a funeral, so because I didn't want to burden her with the cost of a funeral. And that was 30 odd years ago. And I do think sometimes that a lot of us think we want to pay for the funeral beforehand, even though we don't know when we're going to die, just so that, particularly if we've got children and we're on our own, they don't have to have that worry on top of everything else. I had no money, so there was nothing. There was no, well, it was probably more than 30 years ago. There was no money around for her to pay for the funeral, and so I don't know if that is an issue.
I think that's interesting. There's two important points there, Susan. The first is, what is the funeral for? This is how I see it. So I think that there are a number of elements around the funeral that are supportive of those of us left behind with our emotional process. And the first is really the acknowledgement of the ship in which we have all sailed. So our physical bodies, you know, and I have worked now with enough people who have died to really come to terms with how profound it is when we die, you see that disconnection between the soul and the physical body. So what we're doing within the funeral are two things. We are saying goodbye to the physical body, which is, if you like, within the disposal, the cremation or the burial. And within the memorial or the ceremony, we are honouring the life, the soul, the person who lived. So I think those are the two halves for me of the ceremony. And whether you choose to do that in one ceremony, followed by burial, or followed by cremation, or you split the two completely so that you have a private cremation or private burial followed by the honouring of the person who's died, that those are personal choices. So I think that for me is how I view what is the funeral for and what's the emphasis on the funeral. The second point you've raised, Susan, is a really interesting one, which is about funeral plans. So for the first few years, I was very down on funeral plans, partly because I felt that they were probably not worth the paper they're written on in most cases, as in, you know, you could take a funeral plan out when you are 50, but when you are 80, you might have completely different views about what you might like to happen to yourself when you've died. That's the first problem. The second problem is that most funeral plans do not cover the funeral. I mean, I find that absolutely horrifying. So the amount of families who come to me confident that their mum has a funeral plan, only to discover that there are this word disbursements that they must pay out on top, can be quite distressing if you think that you have a funeral that's paid for. So those are my issues with funeral plans. And also that I found that most funeral plans were packages. Now, you know, going back to my view that we're all individuals and that we should be creating ceremonies that are appropriate to the individual, a package is not, you know, a one-size-fits-all approach means that some people will have paid for some things that they don't necessarily want or need. There is, however, now a new type of funeral plan, which I have just recently started. I do sell them if people want them. And that is called open funerals. You're right there, Sheena. And that's called open funerals. And that allows you, it works similarly to an ISA. And I think, Mary, when you came in to speak to you, I talked to you about this. I've often said to families, look, don't have a funeral plan, open an ISA. You know, put some money in an ISA. You'll get just as much, you know, our rubbish in interest at the moment doesn't mean very much, but you'd get just as much in an ISA as you would in a funeral plan. And then that money can be used for what you specifically want it to be used for. And on the point of your death, your family will always there. So that's not a problem. Open funerals offer a plan. I mean, I must say, I don't receive any money from open funerals. If you were to take out a plan with me, it doesn't give me any money. It's a completely separate business. But they offer funeral plans that are much more flexible. So you can put in for a pot. You can decide what you want that money to be spent on, but equally, if your family wanted to use the entire pot to bring Auntie Mildred and her family over from Australia for the funeral, you could use it for that. So there's a lot more flexibility, and I think that's more helpful, really. So I hope that answers your questions, Susan.
David Hare wrote a play many years ago, which I went to see. He's a brilliant playwright, called Whispering Judges. And in this, what he showed was that all around this service, you know, to the judge and the prosecutor and the defense, were all there competing against each other and forgetting the person who they were there for, who was kind of nearly forgotten. And I think that is what is been happening, sadly, with a lot of funerals and funeral directors. It was all about the periphery around it, and
hardware,
the actual person themselves. And I think you have well emphasized that and produced and put it more the person more forefront, which I thank you for.
Oh, thank you. He's a wonderful playwright, isn't he? And I think you're absolutely right. We, you know, I mean, I think it's not, we live in an age now, don't we, where we talk a lot. I mean, people, you know, they post selfies of their lunch. I mean, we, you know, we are in an age of the individual. But I think actually we forget what that really means, you know, and at the point of death, that becomes, I think, really important for those of us left behind. You know, how do we say goodbye? How do we reckon with the person who has died? And great if you've got a framework for that, but you will still need to make some specific choices in how you access that framework.
I think I have to say I was very lucky, because with both my parents, I was with as you say, by their, I mean, I was with them when they both died for about the week or, well, for the weeks before they died. So I was able to say goodbye at their death. And of course, a lot of people can't do that. So.
We've become quite removed from death. I mean, you know, 75% of us, when asked, would like to die at home. The reality is that 75% of us die in hospital. That's just, and I think, you know, so again, it's about conversations around death and dying, isn't it? The more we have the courage to have these conversations, the more likely we are to move toward, as we all move towards this inevitable end, the more likely we are to have a death that befits what we would hope it to be.
Dee, you mentioned Bristol Coffin when you were talking about Harbourside.
Yes.
What do you mean?
So I worked with, again, this is a kind of response to the MDF issue. You know, the MDF issue is quite a challenging one because coffins that look like coffins is really important to a lot of people. One of the big pressures when you are organising a funeral, I feel from my clients, is it must look like a funeral. You know, I don't want people to think that I'm not respecting my mum if I was to create a funeral that didn't look like a funeral. And that actually, the coffin is a big part of that. So the lacquered funeral shaped coffin with the gold tops and the gold handles, for some people is an intrinsic vision of the funeral. Now, I mean, for a start, the gold is not gold, obviously, it is plastic. And the wood is not wood, it is plastic. And the actual interior is a composite solvent. So it is an illusion of what we think a coffin should look like. But it's also a very handy tool for the industry. Now, you know, if I was to tell you that those coffins to the industry are worth about £60, but a funeral director would sell them on for about £450, you start to see how the industry is really serving itself rather than socially serving us all. So we've kind of bought into a construct of what we think a funeral should look like. So the Somerset wood recycling coffin is made from recycled wood pallets. Now, it's not for everyone, Mary, I have to say. It's very rustic looking. You can see one on our website. It will work for very few people. I know that. But in effect, it was partly a way of us saying, look, we need to think about this. You know, the industry isn't going to change because it works for the big boys. You know, if you're making that kind of markup on a coffin, then you're not going to turn away from that anytime soon. So partly it was about saying, look, we could have other coffins. I mean, it's a very well-made coffin. It just looks quite rustic, but there are other options. So we sell an awful lot of willow, which is very sustainable. It's a fast growing material. It's locally grown on the Somerset levels. It's hand woven. And because of the way that we work, so I made a decision to charge a fee for my time, and then all the other costs I pass on to my families at cost. So you would buy a willow coffin from us that actually would cost pretty much the same as an MDF coffin would if you were purchasing a package from one of the high street, you know, the mainstream companies. It's just for me about being a little bit more transparent and trying to encourage us to think about these matters. A cardboard coffin or a natural board coffin, which is the same shape, now much better than they were a few years ago. I mean, they don't look like flat pack coffins from IKEA anymore. They actually look like nice coffins. I mean, but it is, a coffin is a coffin. You know, I don't think personally that the coffin is as important as the ceremony, is as important as the words that we all say. I don't think a coffin is as important as sharing your memories of someone who's died. I think the coffin is one element. And so for me, I don't need the gold handles or the lacquer. I just want a bit more authenticity, really. I do hope this is helpful.
Well, I found it very helpful anyway. Thank you.
It's great. It's wonderful, Dee. Thank you so much. I've got all sorts of little memories going through my head, but the one that's on the surface is of sitting by the burning ghat in Kathmandu and meditating for an hour, and that was yeah. Different cultures have different ceremonies, and they're all appropriate. But you know, somebody dies and their body is burning an hour later. Yes. You know, and then the whole family actually come. The family take up residence in a place by the burning ghat, and friends and relatives come and visit over the next 10 days or so. And I think that's very beautiful that you have a.
I'm fascinated by how removed we have become, really, from the emotional connection to the funeral. You know, the amount of people, when I was initially working as a celebrant, who would use phrases like, well, once we've got through the funeral, or once we've got the funeral over and done with, as if the funeral itself was not of any value. It was just a process, you know. Whereas what I've realized is exactly what you're talking about, David, how touching, and it's okay to be touched in our lives. It's okay to engage in the emotional process of the death of someone that you have loved. The people who have said, well, I wouldn't want to play that piece of music because it might make me cry. And I think, well, you know, it's okay to cry. It's really okay to connect with your soul to the loss of someone that you've loved. That is, for me, the real wonder of working in this world, of really helping people connect so that they are able to move forward with their lives, enriched, not taken away, but enriched.
In talking about grief, it reminded me when I lived in Iran, I came across their custom of having, it was 40 days of grief. And I adopted this with my husband and my mother. And it was actually very helpful that you felt you could behave exactly as you wanted to for a limited time.
And you see, I think, you know, when I said that what we're doing isn't new, it really isn't. You know, in the 1800s, really pre-Victoria, I would be called Mrs. Edwards. I would be living on the edge of Bristol, and you would all know who I was. And you would phone me when the time came, and I would come and I would lay out your mother at home, and all the neighbours would come and they would sit with your mum and they would share food with you, and the process of grieving would begin. But you see, I find it quite fascinating that really it was, you know, part of how we've managed to get where we are, which is, you know, quite removed from that process, came really from Queen Victoria, and this idea that grief was an unseemly thing for a woman particularly to be involved in. And so the Men in Black came on board, and she moved funerals out of the home and into funeral parlours on the high street. And there's no surprise here that she called them funeral parlours. You know, I find all of that fascinating, that history. And she did it because her own grief for Albert was so intense that she couldn't cope with it, and she felt no one should go through this. But over the years, that seed has become what I would say is quite a shallow rooted tree that is not really, that's shielding us all from what can be a very important process. And whether that's 40 days or whether you know, in my case, it was about staying home with my family and really allowing myself to feel the loss of Billy's future, for feeling the loss of our family, and also with my grandparents for feeling the loss of their fabulous life experience in my life. You know, how do we get in touch with that? So yes, I think wonderful, Mary, that you were able to do that, and I hope it was really helpful.
The Death Cafe in the Gloucester Road has closed, hasn't it? So might yours be a substitute?
Well, there's there's a death cafe that's run by Mary, can't remember her surname at the moment, but they have a very active Facebook page. And it was until COVID taking place at Arnos Vale. And we did talk quite a lot about whether I started one up in North Bristol at the Sanctuary. We ran the first death cafe in Bristol from Kingsdown. And then the following year, that was about 6 years ago. And then the following year, we held the first family death cafe at the Bristol Museum, which was, quite an extraordinary experience, really, because there's nothing like having children on board to really, really focus the mind, I can tell you, and their views on death and dying are really interesting. So that was a good experience. I suppose I have, COVID, to be honest, really stopped us all in our tracks, didn't it? It for me, I value this talk today, but I would so much prefer to be sat in a room with you all. And the thing with the death cafes is, whilst they aren't grief and bereavement services, they are not supposed to be groups for people to pour out their grief. You are often talking about quite sensitive issues for people. And so for me, I would be much happier about revisiting the process of running a death cafe. I think once we can actually all be together, I think I would find that more helpful.
We had a good one in Portishead Library, but that's closed. Pre-COVID it closed. But it was so interesting, so good.
I find them amazing because the converse. I must have run 20 or so death cafes now. Each one is so different. Each one brings its own flavour based on the people who are there, and again, they're not morbid experiences. I found them to be really, really quite profound meetings. There is something for me really amazing about the authenticity of death. We spend an awful lot of time, particularly online now, being who we think people might want us to be. I think particularly the younger generation. And actually funerals is the one place where you can only really turn up as yourself. And I see that most effectively at funerals that sadly are run for someone who's died young. And I think that, we had a funeral last week for a young woman who'd sadly died by suicide. And it was one of the most touching experiences I've ever come across, because within the ceremony, all of these young single men talked about their sadness. Where else do you find young men talking about their feelings, So to be able to hold a space that is authentic, I just find it's just one of the greatest parts of my job, really.
Well, I'm sure we could go on for a while about this, but we have reached that time in today for us to slowly creep away. So before we all go, let me remind you of who next Friday will be engaging with us. That is Eleanor Kershaw, whose title is Competing Equality, Women's Rights, Gender Identity, and Quakers.
Well, thank you all so much for having me today. It's been really wonderful to talk to you all, and I hope it was helpful. And if you do have any further questions, then I'm sure you can get in touch with me. And please do. We're always open for any chats. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dee, so much. It's great.
Oh, thank you.
Right.
Bye-bye all.
Good.
You're a great bunch.